So this is kind of almost like the follow-up session to the. I don't know how many people were in the first session where we talked about video podcasting and kind of the drilled down into more of the video type technologies. When I talked to Abraham about that, about these sessions, he said, well, do you think we should split it up into two? And I said yes, because I don't think everyone wants to necessarily go out and do video on the web. Maybe you want to start as a blogger and do radio journalism on your blog. When we started our podcast year and a half, almost 2 years ago, we started as an audio podcast, and video was just an afterthought with a webcam, and we got into that a little bit in the last session. It's now turned into a video and an audio podcast, but I think it's pretty valid to really drill down into what it takes to do audio podcasting and the differences. So I'm Mike, drnormal, strangeoflive.com, weekly tech talk show and nothing else. And I'm here with Rob Manning from OPB, Ethan Lindsay was actually going to be our presenter. He caught a very, very bad bug, but he's recovering nicely. Do you have an update?
Well, he's actually going to be working for about 2 days next week and then a day the week after, and then he's actually getting married. So
great.
Things are getting better for him. But yeah,
so Ethan's doing well, and we're very happy about that.
Yeah.
Next slide. So we've got a proposed agenda, and because this is a camp, in my mind, we also want input to the agenda, where we want to focus, if there's anything you want to look at. We want to talk first about audio journalism practices and techniques. Rob, being an OPB journalist, has a lot of good info as to how to create that story with audio, which you'll find is a lot different than with writing or blogging. And then audio recording and editing, kind of the nuts and bolts, software, compression, those types of things, and then where to publish on the net. And so I just open it up to any. Does that kind of cover it for folks? Are there some specific areas that you have questions about for podcasting and audio on the web? I'd love to talk about that, and that's a real. Actually, Marshall Kirkpatrick is here, and maybe we can talk a little bit about that later. The future of search is how it involves multimedia and audio. I find that in multimedia and audio, search, SEO, all these things seem to break down. It's tough to get proper analytics as opposed to blogging and web. It's a good question. I don't know that we can solve that here, though. So let me turn it over to Rob.
Right. Were there any other suggestions of what we should touch on that Mike didn't mention already? No. Yes. Okay. Mike, did you hear that?
Mobile publishing?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, yeah, we should cover that.
Okay.
Pretty well.
Okay. This is basically just quickly. I started with radio basically at the very tail end of quarter-inch tape, so I've sort of kind of had to go through several quantum leaps of what the technology is like and what the demands are. A lot of things sort of remain the same though throughout. There are certain principles of what good sound is, what a good story is to someone's ear, that I think kind of remain the same. And then there are some things that, especially when you move from analog to digital, there are some things that obviously change. And then the platform, what you're actually sending it to, whether it's out over a broadcast or whether it's on the net, is going to be a little bit different. But one of the things that, and this is maybe consistent with other media, but to research before you do a whole lot of recording, it's you really want to make sure that you get the interview right the first time. I mean, this is especially if you're doing. I'm thinking of, when you're producing something as a finished piece rather than if you're going to run a long form interview, especially. Well, actually, it works for both of them, but you want to know sort of, as much information as you can before you're actually going to record someone. It, just makes the interview obviously go a lot more smoothly. You're going to wind up with better sound, more intelligent questions, and more intelligent responses as a result. There are obviously going to be, it's an iterative process to a degree, though. You'll conduct the interview and you'll learn something, and then you'll realize, oh, I should probably go back and, do another interview, and a lot of that depends on how much time you have. Certainly in my business, you wind up turning things around in a few hours or in a day, and depending on whatever genre you're working in, maybe you do something once a week, maybe you do something on deadline, constantly rolling the way, someone like me does. That's going to, it doesn't really replace the fact that you're going to research and then record as sort of your process, but it may limit the number of times you can go back and record again, depending on what your timelines are. In public radio, we tend to work in 3 different formats. One of them is very common with commercial broadcasting, which is a 1-minute news spot. It's basically going to be essentially a minute long. In commercial, it's actually down to 40 or 45 seconds, which is 40 to 45 seconds is basically 5 sentences. And it might have a cut of tape in the middle of it. And the rest of it will be either your voice or it'll be the voice of the news anchor. And then there'll be what we call an actuality in the middle. That's a piece of sound that tends to be, in public radio, it's not going to be longer than 25 seconds for a short piece. In commercial broadcasting, it's probably not going to be more than 15. So that's sort of the news spot in a newscast. You hear one, you hear another, then you're back to the regular program. Also sometimes called a headline. Then in both, sometimes in commercial, but getting increasingly rare, is the short feature. The sound-rich feature is basically not done in commercial broadcasting radio that I've heard in a long time. Both of those basically are going to have multiple people in them. They'll have multiple sources. They'll have they'll have you ostensibly as the person who narrates throughout, and then multiple viewpoints throughout.
Is a sound-rich feature something like This American Life or something like that?
That would be sort of taken to the long extreme.
Okay.
Yeah. I'm thinking that, or like, an All Things Considered story that's reported from, Hurricane Katrina recovery or something like that, where you hear the sound of them cleaning up a building and all of that. And those, in terms of what is interesting to a listener, we will generally, if a story is going to be longer than 3 minutes long, we want there to be what we call a scene, where you put somebody somewhere. You've got background sound of something that's going on, and that helps to sort of suspend a little bit the intensity of how long is this story. You can get people tricked into thinking the story is maybe not as long as it is if you give them interesting things to listen to. If you send them somewhere and you basically involve them in the story that way. If you're not going to be quite as long as that, if it's just 2 or 3 minutes and you've got some really interesting voices to hear from, you don't need a scene per se. So those are basically the formats we work in. And when it comes to actual writing, like if okay, I'm going to be writing, whether it's a news spot or whether it's a longer feature type story, how you write for the ear, like if you're going to be speaking something, is really, really different from how you write so that someone reads it on a page. And you'll notice this if you ever go to like opb.org or npr.org and you can see a transcript of verbatim what the story says. It's all noun, subject, verb, object, and occasionally there'll be a a compound or a little bit of a complex sentence, but 9 times out of 10 they're all simple sentences. And that's because that is how we talk. So we don't talk unless we're reading from prepared remarks in complex and compound sentences. So that's the way we tend to write. And it can be a difficult habit to get into, especially if you're coming from print, where you're accustomed to sort of jamming, 10 facts into a given sentence. There is 1 fact per sentence, basically, in radio writing, and it comes in the form of subject, verb, noun, object. I realize I didn't sort of have a great flow to how these different parts go from one to the other, but in terms of actual recording, there's generally 2 ways that you'll do it. You'll either do it from the comfort of your own station or your own home, or you'll be out somewhere and you'll be in a situation where you're recording and you're bringing equipment with you. The in-studio situation, where you'll either be over the phone talking to someone and recording, or you'll invite them in and you'll have equipment and you'll be able to sit them down and you can dial in everything. That is obviously a much more controlled situation, and you can, have everything prepared in advance. You know what all your settings are. You know how everything is going to go. You could have your research all piled up next to you. In a lot of ways, it's a lot easier. But what you wind up with is, you're going to have relatively canned stuff, because it's going to be either phone tape or it's going to be the tape from the, from whatever relatively soundproof, hopefully, spot that you have in your home office or in your studio. If you're out in the field, that means on the one hand you're going to get maybe more interesting background sound, like if you're going to go on a hike with someone and have them point out rare plants or something like that. You'll have the sound of walking through the forest and all that kind of stuff. But you're also going to have, I've got to pay attention to what's happening with my gear. I've got to make sure my headphone, that the signal I'm getting is okay, and all that stuff that you have preset at home, you've got to sort of make sure is still working all on the fly while you're out in the field. The other possibility is that we run into frequently as news reporters is going to press conferences, and then you're sort of dealing with whatever the setup is there. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's not. Or going to meetings like school board meetings, all that kind of thing, which is stuff that, since I cover education, I do on a pretty regular basis. And the sound systems at school board meetings tend to be awful because schools never spend money to improve their sound systems. So that's always fun to figure out how to deal with that. And the best way to sort of to deal with it that I find for that particular situation is to get there as early as possible and to have people test the system for you and find out. And also the big sort of, whether it's a press conference or a school board meeting, I guess either a press conference or a school board meeting, there tend to be 2 different sources of sound. Either it's going to come in at mic level, which is essentially the same level as your microphone and probably the way that you would be set up if you had a home studio, or it's line level, which is basically a really, really hot signal that's used to drive speakers. And you need to know which one of those it is, because if you're expecting a mic level and you get a line level, it's going to fry your ears and not be usable. And vice versa, if you're expecting a line level and you get a mic level, it's going to be so quiet that it basically doesn't even register. So you want to have, when you're thinking about what equipment to set up, or especially what mobile stuff to have, if you're going to be going out and covering things in the field like city council or school board meetings or going to press conferences, you're going to want to have the ability, if you can, to record both line level and mic level, or at least have adapters and things to turn something that's a line signal into a mic signal. I think we can go to the next. I think did we miss one? Sorry. That wasn't important. Okay, yeah.
2 people.
Right. Right. So in terms of, the fundamentals of writing for a sound piece is that, radio or having, sound on the web is about. I mean, it's about voices. You know, it's sort of like I think of television being about images, and radio is really about voices. It's about like who people are, and it's people telling stories in their own words, and in a way that sort of allows you to be actually more intimate with the person in a way than you can do with a video story. Because with a video story, you may be distracted by how they look or how they're being, you know, what the background is of where they are or what they're wearing. One of the advantages to radio is that's not going to happen. You might be distracted by their accent or something or the way they talk, but there's a lot less standing between you and what they are saying. And so if for instance, you're making a decision between making something a video piece as opposed to making it an audio piece, you might want to make that part of your decision. It's sort of like that the sound is really, if you don't want anything sort of filtering, or if it doesn't have great images but you have a great character, then often radio or audio is going to be the way to do it. So in terms of finding the sound that you want to use for a particular piece, you want it needs to be clear. You know, it needs to be loud enough, not overmodulated, but it needs to be loud enough. It's going to come through strong, and I've got copious examples in my laptop, if you want to see them, of things that don't fit that description that I've caught along the way. And also have it serve the story. You know, if they say something that's just totally, you know, outlandish or really remarkable, but it has nothing to do with the story, you know, you can't necessarily use it. But, you know, find things that are indicative of their point of view. I mean, a lot of it is similar to if you've done other kinds of reporting and writing. Just sometimes there are things that sometimes will work for a radio piece that are, you know, things that particularly work well are when people can give examples of something. Often that sort of, you know, a compelling sort of gives you a little insight into that person as well as serving the story. And if they can tell a story. I mean, if they can tell a story in sort of, you know, 30 seconds or less, then, you know, often you're going to get really far along towards your telling the story. It's great when you can have your characters tell your story, and that's sort of, you know, one of the goals, I think, of doing good audio pieces. And the next two are sort of, you know, in terms of creating scenes and using natural sound, they basically go together. I mean, that is essentially how, if you were to do a piece that's going to be, you know, a sound-rich type of a piece, the way that you want to create a scene, you want to put people where you were, whether it was you were going to a factory or going to, going on a hike or whatever it is. You want to be sure to record all that's going on around you, you know, where you are. So if you're doing an interview with someone and you're talking to them and there is either a piece of equipment operating nearby or, you know, something, you know, some sort of river or whatever, get the sound of just that. And that sort of, and what you're going to later do is blend that in behind your narration with that, you know, the sound of that person, with that in the background. These are just sort of like notes once you've gone out and you've gotten your tape, if you've gotten the tape from, you know, the phone interviews or from interviews actually in the studio. One of the tricks that I learned starting out is that if you can just fade the very beginning and fade the very end, and that is pretty much a feature available in most audio software, you won't get jarring beginnings to every cut of tape that you're using. And so it'll flow, it'll start naturally, and it's really easy little trick that you can do. The other thing is normalizing, which is basically boosting the sound level of the quote. And there is a feature that's actually called normalizing in most software packages. And rather than just gain, which can sometimes raise things that you don't want raised, normalize is a little bit more intelligent. Sometimes that doesn't work perfectly either, and then you can go in and use an equalizer. But those are sort of two handy tricks that I do basically with all the tape that I use. It's always going to get normalized, and it's always going to have fades at the beginning and the end. and stories that breathe is just sort of there's a temptation to sort of packing the quotes in with your narration and having it be really tight, but you want to give listeners a little bit of a chance to digest what it is that has just happened, what people have just said. So if you can, especially the longer the piece is, the more important this gets, where you just sort of give a little bit of silence in between, or use a little bit of the natural sound if you've got that going in the story to sort of, just sort of break things up a little bit. Because if you've got something that's just boom, 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 and it goes on for 5 minutes or more, you're going to have tired people out by the time you get to 2 or 3 minutes. And unless it's just absolutely riveting stuff, they're not gonna stay with you. The ethics point we could probably talk about for a while. But the main thing, and this is sort of a no-brainer, is that if you're, I hesitate to even mention it, but it's sort of like people tend to. I mean, you want to tell people basically when you're recording them. I mean, in my understanding of the law in Oregon is I don't think you actually have to. But our policy at OPB is that if you're going to record it, if you're going to put someone on the air, you will let them know that you are recording them and that you intend to use it for broadcast. There's lots of other stuff that I could go into, but that's sort of a, just if we wanted to talk more about that, we could. Just a couple of places to look at stuff. PRX.org is basically an online place where public radio reporters and especially freelancers will post their stuff. And there's whole shows. There are just feature stories. There's things that have aired on member stations or on NPR, or that maybe haven't aired anywhere that you can find there. Free Speech Radio News is actually a place that before I was at OPB I contributed to a fair amount. It's a place that you can, if you're a freelancer or interested in doing freelance radio stuff, they buy stuff from freelancers all the time. So it's a place you can go and actually sell stuff. It's a half-hour long program that's carried by community radio stations. So KBOO I think still airs it in its. I think it's in its entirety. Sometimes for a while they were cutting it up and just using the pieces. But it's run by community radio stations all over the country. Indie media is kind of along similar lines. And the BBC is just sort of where NPR learned how to do what it does, frankly. And still does it better. But they have, and they have lots of great stuff on their site about, which are good examples of formats that you can play with. There are things NPR has gotten really focused on doing a couple of different formats. BBC is still a little bit more experimental or a little more cutting edge about what they will do in terms of mixing up formats, like doing a Q&A that goes into a feature that comes back into a Q&A. And it's just kind of fun to listen to what they have online, and you can listen to BBC World Service is on OPB at night. You can hear it there too. So that's just basically an overview. There's lots more I could go into if you have questions. I'm less of the technical person. I regret that in some ways that you didn't get to hear from Ethan, because Ethan really knows this stuff backwards and forwards, and he is obviously not able to be here, but I can answer questions as best I can for you.
So I think the next section we're going to talk a little bit, kind of an overview of audio recording and editing. Did you just want to talk a little bit about your setup that you use, your digital recorder?
Sure.
I don't know if you...
I do have it with me. I can grab it real quick.
So we'll put the show and tell section here at the top. I can preface this by essentially in the video session we talked about, to start out, can you use what you already have, and more so even for audio than video. Many of you may already have a tape or digital recorder, hopefully digital. Often they record down to a chip that you can then load onto your computer and edit and post. I keep emphasizing Skype. How many people have used Skype? How many people use Skype here? So all of you have the ability to podcast and produce audio on your laptops. You probably have a headset or some sort of rig to use Skype and a method to record. So you probably already have that. I also threw in a still or video camera. People often forget, they go somewhere and there's a story or something going on, and they might have like a digital still camera that takes movies onto the chip inside, and oftentimes some of those still cameras have pretty good sound and pretty good microphones on them. So you can actually just use a video camera or a still camera to capture the sound and then use that for the story. The basics of audio gear, we all have headphones. Microphones can run from everything from that headset, USB headset that many people have. They're actually very good now, the USB-based systems. I think if you pay, I don't know what they run now, but $50, $100 or something like that. Yeah. Yeah, I've heard the Plantronics is good. Ed mentioned that, and that was around $90. And then there's also the higher end type audio, which is, for example, these mics are you find these mics in sound reinforcement in music. They're Shure 57s. They use an XLR connector. If you were to use some mics, when I started podcasting, I have a background in music as a musician, so obviously I had things I could use to podcast. So I pulled out some mics, I pulled out the XLRs. Oftentimes you might need a preamp and some sort of USB interface to capture that audio. In my case, I had a digital recorder for my music, so I just recorded it there and exported it out. So just look around and see what you've got. In the higher end, like what we use and what Rob might use in the studio, you then get into audio mixers like you have in the studio, and digital recorders for music. I put a couple links here. Portland Music Company, they're local. Guitar Center is arguably local because they acquired a company called Musician's Friend, which was actually an Oregon company, so I forgot that they kind of have local ties. I think if you walked into any of these guys, Guitar Center or Portland, and said, I'm looking for equipment to podcast with, they know what's going on. As soon as you walk past the kid trying to play Stairway to Heaven on the guitar and go to the pro audio section, they can help you out with software. So don't forget that the music stores actually have inventory and have things available. So did you want to show your setup?
Well, basically it's like Mike was saying, this microphone is very similar to a Shure 57 or Shure 58. It's unidirectional. That's one of the things that one of the questions would be either a unidirectional versus an omnidirectional. Omnidirectional means what it sounds like. You're going to catch sound from all kinds of different areas. I find that there are more limited uses for an omnidirectional mic. I've got a single directional mic basically, and it's better for getting interviews. So that's what this is. This is just a standard XLR cable, which is the same thing that connects a microphone to a PA or to a recorder anywhere. The recorder is a Marantz, which is one of the major audio recording companies. This is, when it was bought new, was like probably $800 or $900, but you can get them now down to like $200 or less, that are practically as good, if not just as good. It runs on batteries. It also has an AC adapter. It records onto flash cards, which are sort of just like the ones that cameras used to use a lot and now don't use so much. A 1 gig card is about all I've really ever had to use, because it fills It's about 3 hours worth of uncompressed sound, dot wave sound. And if you set it for MP3, if that's, I tend to like having wave to work with. That's broadcast quality as opposed to MP3, which is not. But MP3 tends to be what we use when we post to our website. So if you're only going to be on the web anyway, you might use the MP3 setting, and then you're recording like 10 hours worth of audio, which is probably more than you ever want to have to go back through again. So, maybe you don't record 10 hours of audio anyway.
So I
yes,
wanted to show another piece of gear. I was hoping Doug Coleman would show up to this session and bring his Zoom. What is this? The Zoom 8 handy recorder H4. The Zoom. It's essentially kind of a smaller model to digital recorder, much like the Marantz. I imagine you've had your eye on one of these because it's a little smaller, easier to carry. These are very, very popular. They have onboard mics. Doug, you go around and record sessions. You use the onboard mics. They work pretty good.
And one of the cool things about that, they have digital mic modeling, so to model some of the higher end microphones. And it does a really good job. So, like a SM57 is good for, like speaking and compressed type stuff, but a different model mic is better for music.
And you record down to SD card, and you can do WAV or MP3. The other thing I like about these, I don't have one, but if I were doing, I don't do a lot of field recording. If I did, I'd get one of these. It has XLRs on the bottom here, so you could go to a press conference, or you can actually they're both XLR and quarter inch. Both here, a hybrid connector. So you could go to a press conference and plug into their sound system, or you can bring some better mics to sit down. So these things are very versatile. I happen to know an Australian podcaster who uses this all the time, and he plugs in his XLRs and puts his flag on his mic and rides the Macs and does his own kind of sound reports. So $40 Olympus note taker for MP3s.
But if you want something a little higher quality, Wave is way down.
Right. And what does this run there about? Did you know? $300. Yeah. And I think you can get these like I said at the music shops or whatever. So definitely Price Shop, or you can get them online.
Mm-hmm. You have a question? Mike.
Well, along the lines of using what you already have, has anyone tried like a decent microphone plugged into, or a semi-decent mic plugged into the iPhone with the new voice memo?
That's a good point. I just finally upgraded my iPhone, and now you get the default voice recorder with it, and I tested it with my headset very briefly, and it seemed okay. How does it export? Do you know what format? Does it export an MP3? Because you have to get it down to your computer. Okay. Okay. But that is a good point, because a lot of people are carrying the...
And the nice thing about it is, at least with the iPhone as opposed to the touch, you already have a mic built in. So you can just use the same mic that you use when you use it as a handset and talk to people and record, and it doesn't come out to be... I haven't listened to it on like the 4-foot tall speakers on the Sirius sound system at home or anything, but it does tend to be pretty decent quality as far as that goes. And if you don't have an iPhone and just have an iPod, you can buy a microphone for like $30 to just plug into the headphone jack of an iPod and go point your microphone at people. I have one of those that I've used that works really, really well.
So let's talk about software. Hopefully we need to move on here. I think you touched a lot on this already. Again, I provided a wiki link to software. It's a great resource. It gets updated all the time. There's one for video gear as well, for video editing software. Some free software products on the Mac. You have GarageBand, which has a lot of built-in podcasting. I think GarageBand has the what do they call it when you voice over and bumps the background audio down?
Oh, I don't know.
Yeah, the ducking. Thank you. It's ducking. Yeah, it has some ducking features, and then there's also built-in publishing features to GarageBand to actually publish up to iTunes. Audacity is a very popular open source free product. It is a audio editor. You can edit all kinds of different formats and then compress into your MP3s. It runs a multi-platform because it's open source, of course. The low mid-range, I'm a Windows guy, so I've used Sony Sound. It's now Sony, but it's SoundForge. Apple Logic Studio is one. I don't know if you know any others.
Yeah.
You use the high end, so
Yeah, I mean exactly.
and then the high end is obviously you guys are using Pro Tools. Ableton maybe arguably on the high end as well. I think it's couple $200-$300 maybe. The key, and I think this was the piece that you added, that the key thing is to overcome.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of audio problems, it's hard to fix them later. If the best thing is to do everything you can to get good sound at the time that you're getting the sound. And there are some problems that are easier to fix later. I mean, if you're just like if you're in a really clean background sound-wise environment and you just recorded too quiet, you can get away with boosting that sound later, and there's not a lot of other stuff that you're going to wind up boosting accidentally. But in terms of getting a sound that's way too hot, that's over-modulated, there's not a lot you can do with that later. You can make it quieter, but it's still going to sound like it's all distorted. So the real key is to have your headphones. Even though do your interviews. I always do my interviews, or practically always do my interviews with my headphones on, so you know exactly what you're getting at the time that you're getting it. Because if you're going to try to use it later, and you're just going to trust that we're getting a good signal, you might be disappointed, and you might be frustrated by the fact you can't make it better later. So yeah.
The answer is it's the Apple AAC M4A format.
So, unless it's DRM, though, you could probably use software to convert it to an MP3.
Or Wave or whatever.
Yeah.
I have to convert it in for
Yeah.
MP3, and it's usually not big a deal. I have a 2.5-minute file that's 6.3 meg.
So, that's actually a good intro to the next slide. File formats on the web. Unlike video, when you're publishing audio to the web, there's really one standard. Now, I know there's all kinds of different formats, but there's really one standard that everyone's using, that Apple popularized, and that's the MP3. Unlike video, where you have arguably 2 or 3 different standards. When you are recording for the web, and I think you've kind of touched on this pretty well in your presentation, Rob. One thing I think about is considering the less optimal listening environment. So when someone's listening to my podcast, I know people who said they go to the gym and listen to it in their iPod with all the background noise going on in the gym. A lot of people listen to podcasting in their car. You burn it to a CD, or you have that plug, the iPhone dock, and you can listen to podcasts in the car. Or on the laptop, either with good headphones or oftentimes just with the crappy speakers on the laptop. And, I'm sure some of you have really nice laptops that have very nice laptop speakers. Those speakers are crappy comparatively to good speakers, as we all know. So when you're producing for this type of environment, especially with dialogue, you want to make sure it's intelligible. That if we're sitting here and I'm interviewing Rob, or we're going back and forth, you need to be able to hear us rather than a whole bunch of background noise. Say we're interviewing a chef in a kitchen and all you hear is the kitchen noise. So you need to keep that in mind when you're editing and posting your audio. Some of that is done with the sibilance of the sound, although you can, and I know I have often gone overboard. And that's sibilance is just to get the essentially your upper end. I think it's the formats of your voice of what makes the sound of the consonant that you're making. Kind of tells your brain what's coming next. I'm digging this out of a physics of audio that I took 20 years ago. So.
Well, I think the principle involved is sort of, it's almost like the idea of contrast in video, where it's like you don't want the principle of the picture to fade into the background, and the audio equivalent of that is you want to make sure that there's enough contrast between what the person is saying that you want the listener to be able to hear and whatever's happening in the background. So sometimes there can be something loud going on in the background, but if it's at a pitch that's significantly different from where the speaker is at, you can sometimes actually deal with that. But if it's also like a mid-range hum or a mid-range sort of clatter of some kind, and it's really right there in the same range that your ear is listening for a speaking voice, it's not going to work. And some of that just comes with experience, but sometimes you might just want to avoid it all by getting a quieter place.
Right. And that's a good point, because what your ears and your brain process isn't necessarily what the microphone's going to process.
Right.
I was talking to someone, a podcaster, just recently who uses wireless condenser mics, and he sits in his cube and he hears what he hears. He puts on the wireless mics. Suddenly, people walking down the hall are heard. Those mics are a lot more sensitive to sound than your ears. Your brain does a lot of filtering and focusing on sound that those microphones aren't doing. So, right. Yeah. So what you want to do is test the sound with the mics. Listen in the headphones. What's the mic picking up? It might be picking up something you didn't realize is being picked up in that environment, and you need to make some changes.
Yeah, fans and fluorescent lights are horrible offenders.
TriCasters, especially.
Yeah.
Yeah. Turn your cell phones off.
Cell phones, turn completely off, not just on vibrate, because if they're catching a signal, it's going to blip through.
Yep, that's a good point. So, want to run through file compression quickly. Again, this is all based around MP3. File compression, like video file compression, is very key. One being that your file size is based on the run length of your content times the bit rate. Also in audio, which is the same for video as well, audio quality is really determined by a higher bit rate. So MP3 is a lossy compression format. I put down what I consider my general principles of bit rates for good audio. These are generally kind of people generally agree on this, although I just say this is my opinion. If you're compressing your MP3s at 16 or 32 kilobits, I kind of call that the telephone sound. That may be acceptable for a 2-hour lecture, because maybe I don't have any calculations up here, but that file could be very, very big at 256 kilobits, and you want a file that's easy to download and easy to stream. So if you're at a two-hour lecture, you might actually need to compress down that far, but listen to it. Be aware of that. 64 kilobits I kind of call a good AM radio sound. 92 is getting into that FM type sound, and 128 and above to me is the near CD quality sound. And so if you're doing talk, you can often, I've for a long time have been compressing our show at 64 kilobits because we're just a talk show, and it sounds pretty good, and we've got a nice tight file to download. I've now bumped that up to 92 for a little bit better quality. If I were doing a music program, or if I were featuring a story on music and musicians, I would probably want to get up into the 128 kilobit range, just for a better sound quality. What do you know what you post at for OPB?
For MP3, I think it's at 64.
Okay.
But it's one of those, we set it a long time ago, and I don't pay attention.
Yeah,
to it
and that's the thing. Once you do kind of set it, kind of roll with it for a while, unless at some point you come back and say, I want to improve the quality of my audio, or I want to change the file size of my download. Those would be reasons to mess with this once you've got a best practice. So choose the correct bitrate for your content and platform. Keep in mind that 2-hour lecture, if they're downloading at 256 kilobits, you may not get people wanting to download a big, large file. Edit your audio mix with the target bitrate in mind. If you're down here in these lower bit rates, you might have to boost some of the higher end. They tend to kind of boost the mid-range and cut off the high end and the low end.
Which is why it sort of doesn't matter if you're dealing primarily in talk, because it's like most of that's going to be in the mid-range anyway.
Right. Unless you've got background noise and you're trying to get those
Right.
voices out. And the last one Rob touched on is always keep a lossless master copy. So I would recommend, I know Rob would recommend, if you can, record in the wave, record in a lossless CD quality, and keep that as a master. I know I have every audio master of our podcast in a wave CD 44 kilohertz 16-bit format. Down the road, when people can download bigger files, they might get recompressed to a higher bit rate. When OPB comes and says, "Hey, I want to use your show and broadcast your show," now I can give them my broadcast copy. Don't this is the target internet consumer level. Keep a good master copy. If you can't do that, that's fine, but that's just a good recommendation. You will need hard drive space though. So keep in mind that
I've got 2 external drives at OPB of all my old tape.
I think if we have time for this, this is very similar. RSS enclosures are essentially the method by which we can syndicate this content. So I can't remember. Do you remember when enclosures were included in RSS? What year? Was it 3, maybe?
No, it was later than that. It was
Late 2004. So you're storing your content, your files, up on a server, and you want to syndicate. You want to tell people up on iTunes, that you have posted a new audio file, a new podcast. The enclosure is simply a pointer in that RSS file, that XML file that says, here's where your file, your podcast is located. And then it's your client software, your iTunes or your player, that then knows what to do with that pointer, whether it's start playing it in iTunes or download the file into iTunes and then sync it with your player. That's the key to how we syndicate multimedia content through RSS. And you can look up in Wikipedia and get more info there. The key piece there is you're storing the file somewhere on a server in the cloud, either at a service, on your corporate server somewhere, and RSS is just pointing to the file saying, here's the post, here's where the content is, go get it. And iTunes is, probably the biggest directory service. iTunes is not storing the podcast. It's not storing your file. You're storing that at some other server. iTunes is just the directory that's pointing to it. if you're going to embed your audio into your blog, there's a lot of good Flash MP3 players. You get the embed code, and you just embed that in WordPress or wherever. So I'm using a really old one called Odeo. We're still using Odeo, and it still works. Yeah. I've seen some really good ones for WordPress, and I think if you want to find out more, come to WordCamp. Is it next month? Yeah. And you can find out. I mean, there's a lot of plugins. You can do it in Blogger as well. I think we started using Odeo because we were using Blogger first, and then we moved to WordPress. So, the last piece, really quickly, is use Twitter. Tweet your post. So if you post, if you think of RSS as syndicating your content, use Twitter. There are folks on there who will subscribe either to you or set up a Twitter account for your podcast, and they'll subscribe. So it's a reminder that you're posting content there. If you want to get started really quickly, there are services that you can use your telephone, your cell phone. You can call in and do live streaming and a podcast all in one fell swoop. Blog Talk Radio would be one. TalkShoe. Again, you can use Skype to do some of that. I don't know if they've upgraded it. The quality of Blog Talk Radio and TalkShoe is more along that telephone quality that we talked about in the other slide, but it is a very quick, easy way to get up and do podcasting without a lot of things happening on your end. Don't forget that there are video streaming services. If you want to stream your content live, you can use one of the video streaming services. You can plug in a camera or just have a blank screen and roll your audio. And live, the thing you get with live streaming is social interaction and chat and all that. So those are just a few things. So is this a last slide, I think? Yep. We have no time for Q&A.